Welcome to Renegading. One of the central ideas in the push for globalisation has been for the state to become subservient to the corporates and for citizens to become submissive consumers. Is it any wonder that our political classes are so loathed after dancing to the tune of corporate lobbyists who've pushed this agenda for decades? Around the world, politicians and their economists have peddled the idea that substituting sovereignty for global corporate interests has been a price worth paying. But many people aren't convinced. So with globalisation in retreat and the balance of economic power shifting, we ask, what are the lessons we can learn from the ideology that has always put profit before people and planet? Joining me to discuss the effects of globalisation are the former IMF economist Magda Polan and the author and founder of Radix think tank Zammit-Lucia. Magda, one of the big problems that we have when we talk about globalisation is that people see that word and hear it, and it means so many things to so many different people. How do you define globalisation as we look at it today, sitting here, 2019?
I think globalisation for a lot of people who can see it in their normal life is that the distances between both the physical goods, people that produce them, but also financial events and political events became so much closer. So you consume goods that were made in China, Vietnam, Ethiopia, with copper that was being imported from Chile. So you have all these connections, and thanks to also faster trading and faster shipping routes, you can get these things done much more quickly. But it's more than that. It's that company from China which, say, invest in Chile that affects companies operating in, say, UK, suddenly has impact on your life here in the UK. Then the political event in that country and their decisions, or maybe a political conflict between three countries somewhere far away, starts affecting our life because our political, economic, financial, trading connections have become so integrated.
What have been, in your view, the negatives, the things about globalisation which have removed either identity or people's culture or people's sort of personal view on the world?
Well, it's probably the easiest to identify the economic downsides of it. And that boils down to political choices in many countries. Let's say Europe, which until the 60s, 70s relied heavily on industry, was then upstaged by cheaper manufacturers in Asia. Some countries handled that well. They managed to transition their industrial workers into other jobs.
Give us an example of one of those countries.
I think Netherlands is probably one of the good examples of that. Other countries handled that less well.
And an example of that would be?
Well, parts of the UK still suffer from the effects of deindustrialization. We still have quite some towns where there is really not much activity happening, and there is the hollowing out of cities. And other countries that we can see as both success and small success is post-communist countries, which suffered from both the deindustrialization shock, globalization shock on steroids, and the collapse of a political system. Say Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, they managed to handle it relatively well, while in some other countries we had a bit less progress in transitioning from that model of the world to another. And then indeed, you do have those cultural aspects. Suddenly, you get flooded by goods from other countries. Suddenly, you have American television everywhere. Or nowadays, you have Russian and Chinese TV as well. I saw it myself, having grown up in a post-communist country, that suddenly the culture starts getting affected by the arrival of Barbies and pink and blue distinctions. And, so with the goods and marketing comes the cultural aspect of that. And that starts to change a culture. But I don't think it is replacing the culture. I think it just simply affects it. It makes it more homogeneous. We are more similar. We all watch Game of Thrones. We all watch the same series on Netflix.
Well, we don't know, and that's the point, isn't it? We don't all watch it, because that's the trick of globalisation. We all. But I don't want my daughters growing up with the stereotypes of, for instance, Barbie. So I want to shield them from that. And I also want to shield them from the consumerism that has absolutely ripped the West apart.
And you see, I think that comes now to choices, both political and personal choices, right? So I don't think people have become slaves to globalization. It is great to have things. It's great to have a job that allows you to buy them. And all these people who got their jobs, and thanks to the reforms in many emerging market countries that allow them to be competitive on the international stage, allow them to attract a lot of foreign direct investment, but also mobilize domestic investment. so they became rich enough to have domestic savings, to then be independent from foreign capitals, their quality of life has improved dramatically. The fact that they can afford that Barbie is actually a massive step already from what they were able to afford before. So we can't forget that international trade is lifting people out of poverty. Poverty globally has decreased. We can quarrel about what measure to use, but there is generally much fewer proportionally poor people in the world than there used to be. Quality of life is increasing. Infrastructure quality in emerging markets has improved quite a lot. We see now shift of higher quality manufacturing jobs moving to places like Kenya, Ethiopia, places that you probably just in the 80s associated with massive famine and starvation and African Live Aid. These countries are now becoming the African manufacturing hubs. So there is a massive benefit from these changes.
Joe, globalisation ultimately improves quality of life. Discuss.
I think that at a macro level, that's correct. And I think we need to distinguish between globalization. I use three different terms. There's globalization, there's globalism, which is an ideology, and there's international trade. Globalism, I see as a political ideology that it's, we should all be one, right, and we should all become more homogeneous, more unicultural, which sees difference as something fundamentally bad, as opposed to celebrating diversity.
Right.
So that's what I call globalism. Globalization, I think, includes the trade and economic issues, but it also includes the cultural issues. Now we can watch television from everywhere, we travel more, and it speaks to countries' soft power as much as their hard power. Right. There was a time when everybody wanted Nike shoes, everybody wanted the American way of life. There was a time before that when everybody wanted the British way of life, because that was where the soft power was. So I think globalization has a lot of cultural and political elements, as well as economic elements. What Magda was talking about was, all of those. But in terms of improving people's quality of life, I think that at a macro level, that is correct. But that improvement is not in any way evenly distributed.
That's very correct, yeah.
So, you have some who have been big winners, and you have some who have been big losers from globalization, how it has evolved. Now, we can argue that some countries handled it well and some countries handled it badly. But, these things are actually quite difficult to handle. The idea that if you close all the coal mines, you're going to retrain these people is nice in theory, but the practice of it is actually not that easy. We can't convert people who've been underground for 40 years into programmers for Google. The economists at a macro level say it doesn't matter if you lose 100,000 jobs to globalization, because over time you'll create 150,000. There's an economics or an economist's perspective on this thing, which is very kind of numbers-driven and very clinical. But there are, social issues and political issues that are much softer. And I think what's happening is that they're now coming back to bite us.
When Thatcher came to power, there was a subtle but sure shift in this country, and which was that politicians stopped talking about society and they started talking about the economy. And you never ever hear a politician now talking about society, because the economists ultimately are saying to them, well, what about the economy, the economy, the economy? Well, the economy is one hungry beast which is insatiable. Why don't you guys as economists ever talk about society? Is that too difficult?
Actually, we do quite a lot. And I think it depends also on the education you received as an economist.
But that's fundamentally neoliberal, isn't it? Or neoclassical.
And that's the thing. I think this really shows you that the winning ideology, or the political ideology of the time, also shapes economic education. And economics is a very specific type of, let's say, science.
Well, is it?
That's why I'm saying science,
right,
that affects reality. Because when you think about it, medicine doesn't change that much with the predominating political view, to some extent, about whether obesity is bad or heart disease or whom we should cure. But overall, the advice of a doctor remains more or less the same, regardless of political environment. With economics, because it's such an intersection of political science, sociology, and economical science, it does tend to fluctuate with time.
Right. Well,
I think economists forget that the economy is composed of members of society, and it's really high time we started to make that point much stronger.
Economics, it's not a science in the sense of the natural sciences, but it tries to apply some discipline and some structure.
The rigor.
Rigor to a political ideology. The whole thing starts from what is your worldview. And depending on that, then your economics will be different. But there's one of the issues, getting back to globalization, is that, we all used to talk about the political economy. The fact that politics and economics are inseparable. They live together. What globalization has done is that it has fractured that concept of the political economy, because politics still remains local, national or subnational. That is where political legitimacy still stands. But economics has become global. So now we have a globalizing economy that is not founded on political legitimacy. And this, I think, is a big problem.
So what happened to the coal mines in the UK ultimately is now happening to the British economy, but from a global scale.
Yes, and the British economy has benefited from globalization, but the issue is that we now have multinational companies who, in the past, we used to see multinational companies as a paragon of efficiency, from an economic perspective, that they can move production to the most efficient place, they can find the skills in different places, they can do all that, and they give us efficient production, so we can get things cheaper. And getting things cheaper has always been something that economists have felt is a good thing. It's all very well to say that something is a penny cheaper, but if you've lost your job, then you still can't afford it if it's a penny cheaper. The issue is that the multinational model, we used to think it was a paragon of efficiency and therefore a good thing. Now, it's being increasingly seen not as a paragon of efficiency, but as a way of playing one government off against the other in a race to the bottom. Give me what I want, otherwise I'll take my plant to Vietnam. And that is, if you like, the visible manifestation of the breakdown between politics and finance and economics. And it is one of the adverse effects of the whole globalization movement. Now, we can rant about it, but the question is, what do we do about it?
Welcome back to Renegade Inc. Before we talk more about the backlash of globalisation with Magda, Polan and Joe Zammit-Lucia, let's look at an idea central to the globalisation movement that has been incredibly corrosive for countries, communities, and also for multinational companies. That idea is to maximise shareholder value at any cost.
The shareholder value issue crystallises everything that's wrong with financialised capital, capitalism. What's happened to our economy is that financial techniques have got everywhere, and shareholder value, let's just use these companies, milk them for money, has taken over. This is about power at the end of the day. So we are having, everybody knows inequality has been increasing. This is creating not only all sorts of stresses within the economy. I think Brexit is the result very substantially of the Brexit vote was swung by huge inequality and all this stuff that's going on, all this financial engineering, use of tax havens and all these games that are being put in place. These political problems are going to only get worse, and I think Brexit, the Brexit vote is only the beginning of a very dark road. I mean, it's happening in all sorts of other countries. Inequality is right at the heart of all this stuff, and the shareholder value revolution, this idea that we need to only look after the profits of the owners, is a huge contributor to this big political problem that is sending us in a very dangerous direction now. We need an intellectual revolution and a sort of society revolution about the acceptability of this. I think once we start to take on an analysis that an oversized financial sector, for example, is bad for the economy, we can start opening up all sorts of political possibilities to what to do about it.
If people understood this properly, I think we'd think in a different way about business. Or perhaps what has happened is we have a rhetoric about business which is different from the reality. Because I think the way good businesses actually operate is not they go about maximising shareholder value. In truth, if Jack Welch or any other CEO arrived in his office in the morning and said, "How shall I create shareholder value today?" it's not very clear what you do. These are not the kind of decisions that a CEO is faced with. It's, do we make this product or that one? And of course, if you do that well, you will make profits. But that's the way round it is. And that's the way we need to think about business. And it followed from that the shareholders in these successful companies made a load of money, and the workers did pretty well, and the consumers liked their products, and so on. That's the nature of the large corporation in modern society. Certainly the idea that companies have a duty to avoid tax comes from the shareholder value issue. If you go back to that definition of the duty of directors of a company, it's to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members. I don't quite see myself where avoiding tax comes into that particular statement. But still, we now have a very elaborate industry that is concerned with tax avoidance. And the truth is, if we were serious, there's a lot we could do about that really quite quickly.
Joe, your book, Backlash, Saving Globalisation from Itself. Why should we read it, and how do we save globalisation from itself?
Globalization and international trade has, like everything in this world, delivered benefits and downsides. In general, the benefits have accumulated to a different set of people than the downsides. So the whole system that has served us relatively well is now under strain. So when we say saving globalization from itself, I think it's a question of, if we know the system is under strain, that doesn't mean it hasn't served us well. But if we persist in saying the way we have done it before is the only way, so we must double down, and all these naysayers, they're just against trade and they're just against this and they just don't understand, then, it's for the birds, the whole thing will collapse. On the other hand, if we say the world has changed, the dynamics have changed, we have learned what has worked well and what doesn't work quite as well. So how do we evolve to something that is more appropriate for the 21st century?
And that's taking a step back and saying, let's take the good bits, get rid of the bad bits. And actually what you're saying is we have to step back and become architects again and reimagine.
And so it's very important not to become complacent. The fact that the system worked years ago doesn't mean it's going to work in the future. And the organizations or the people who are responsible for thinking, designing this trading systems or agreements, they need to keep up with the times and keep on improving them.
Who fixes these things? Because ultimately, what we're saying is that it should be the politicians, the economists aren't taking responsibility for it, the policymakers aren't taking it. Who's in control here? Who's in charge? Because it seems to me this is a runaway train.
No, but nobody's in charge of a complex system.
Right.
Like who runs a rainforest? Nobody.
All the participants.
Nobody runs a rainforest. Nobody manages a rainforest. It works because it's a complex adaptive system that finds its way. So I think one of the issues is this belief that somebody can fix the economy. I think, we have a society and we try and set rules for how that society operates, but things change. They change quite rapidly. And I think what we're seeing is that the pace of change that we're seeing at the moment in various, attitudes, in technology, in all sorts of things, in the climate, is actually very fast. Our institutions have difficulty keeping up with that. And this is perfectly normal. In the past, really major episodes of change have happened through collapse. We've had the Great Depression, we've had world wars, we've had revolutions. That's how change has happened. What we're trying to do is to avoid that. If you believe that there's somebody out there who has the answer, fine. But these people don't exist. These people have opinions. So Jeremy Corbyn's answer is fundamentally different from Emmanuel Macron's answer, and it's fundamentally different from President Xi's answer. So who's right?
Right. So even though there's a wealth of research out there and wealth of historical documents and all the rest of it, you've got to just keep muddling on without returning to really first principles.
But let's say there are countries that are doing this, right?
Which ones?
Say Greece, huge collapse in economic activity. The country is taking on a challenge of fixing itself. They got the lifeline, but they need to address the problem. And they are doing it. I think they realized, also the voters, they realized that they need to go with that because otherwise their economy will not function. I think we need to realize, and I've been saying here a few times, that the voters are responsible for that. So that's why we can't sit here and say, who's going to fix the economy? We all need to agree on that we have those politicians who come in with their snake oil, who say, it's going to be great, it's going to be fantastic. And we as voters need to realize that we are responsible for these decisions. And we can't only vote for people who promise us cheap, easy solutions. But also, of course, we need to remember about the connections between business and politics, who influences the debate, whether the votes actually get passed on into end decisions.
And so it's the voter and the lobbyist.
And I think that's where it comes to the globalism.
Yes.
Because on the Greece thing, it's interesting that we don't ever talk about the fact that to get Greece membership before the massive crash, there's a certain financial organisation that told a bunch of lies to get them in. So there isn't just the voter, is there?
Well, no, of course, it is much more than that. But we are all in it together. So as voters, we are also responsible. Right? We do have to take responsible decisions. And of course, because on the local level, we want the right, what's good for us, what's good for families. We want money, we want to have stability of jobs. So that, of course, works on that local level. For a company and a business executive, it works on the local level too. They are expected to maximize shareholder value, they are maximized to expect profit. They want to get their money too. For a politician as well, he wants to or she wants to be re-elected, right?
Right,
and I think that's when the sense of the purpose, longer term goal, all comes into play.
We've reached a period of transition, where the old system is dying, and we don't know what the new one's going to look like.
The interregnum.
The interregnum. So, morbid symptoms happen at this time. We don't know what the new one. And so the question is, there are lots of people who feel they've been left behind, and they're angry.
No, but been left behind.
They have been.
Not feel that they've been left behind, have been left behind.
Yes, absolutely.
Public education's been smashed. They haven't got a job to go
Absolutely.
to. They're on 0-hour contracts.
Absolutely. And
but no one's responsible, apart from the voter.
No. It's not that no one's responsible. It's that we're all responsible.
Right.
So we have to evolve. We have to be able to recognize, I think, two things. That things that we have done in the past may have been appropriate to them. Some of them will have been mistakes. There's no doubt about it.
A property-owning democracy, is that a mistake?
Yeah, I think...
It's just been very difficult to get you to say, these have been mistakes, and we actually need to say, not again with that.
Let's say an endless focus on shareholder value.
Yes.
So maximising shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world?
No, I wouldn't say that, but it was not the best idea. Right. And it shifted incentives in the wrong way because it shifted them towards maximizing the value of the share rather than sustainable business or what the business does to company or to its own workers.
Banks that can create money out of thin air, credit creation within the banking system. Private banks creating credit, is that a good idea?
It's been there and it's in all countries. And in some countries it does work, sometimes it doesn't. And also I guess it reflects how the incentives are structured, right? And also then whether you are in an open or closed economy. Because don't forget that a lot of credit was also created because of capital inflows. So it's not only that the banks have created that. But also then, yes, what are the incentives? How much are you then incentivized to create money? How much are you incentivized to provide credit?
Well, if you're a banker, it's your raison d'etre.
Yeah, but you also have regulation there.
Where?
Of course, there's regulation. It defines quite a lot of your leverage rates or products you can sell, to whom you can sell that. And if there is an oversight of that regulation, that then may lead to a bubble, like it did in 2008.
So how do we then, as we conclude, talk about globalisation, national economy, however we want to talk? What are we suggesting? A bunch of philosopher kings who sit above or aside society saying this is right and this is wrong? Do we have to take it to the moral level? Or are what you both suggesting that actually we just need an absolute pragmatism to what works? Because my question on that is, who decides what works?
The reality is that nobody knows what is going to work in the 21st century because we've never experienced the 21st century. We've never experienced the digital economy. We've never experienced the situation, AI, robotics, whatever. We don't have experience of what's coming. So for me, I think the most important thing is not trying to believe that someone has the answer, but to make sure that our conversations are humble, that we don't know what the answer is, and that we get past sticking to having to do it like we've done it in the past. So it's a willingness to change and a humility to understand that we don't know what the future holds.
Do you think we need more humility, Magda?
Absolutely, yes. But also we need open-mindedness and critical thinking. Right. Very important skills for anybody, including, which I always refer to in this show, voters, right? So we need to have an open mind that we need to try different solutions and that some of them may not work. And we go as we learn, and we've done it for now a few thousand years as human civilization. And we've had those challenges before, so that open-mindedness, willingness to test things, willingness to question old beliefs, and then exactly not looking for the guilty party necessarily, but looking for solutions and procedures would help us from that disorderly adjustment, which is a revolution, war, famine, massive migrations, to a more orderly one.
So one of the points on globalisation, what's the one thing that you think really hasn't worked, keeping that humility in mind?
Probably allowing for so much tax optimization procedures for multinational companies, and that endless focus on the shareholder value as opposed to what the company really is and its role in the community. The other thing that hasn't worked is the exploitation of the environment, the unsustainable practices when it comes to both people and the environment. That hasn't worked. We see the results of that every day, and we're going to see much, much more of that.
What has worked?
Many things have worked, or have been good, have been a good thing. Lots of people in developing countries have been lifted out of poverty, millions of people, because of their ability to trade. We've seen a lot of cultural exchange. We've learned from each other. We've transferred technology so people can develop. At the aggregate level, I think we've made ourselves better off, but with a lot of caveats. An awful lot of caveats, and that's fine. It's impossible to get everything right all the time. It's a question of continuous adjustment. Seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, trying making things better, but trying to change our mindset around things and avoiding getting into it's all his fault and it's all her fault. And, in any system, this has always been the case throughout the century, throughout human history. There are vested interests who benefit immensely from the system as it currently is. And those people will always fight to keep the system as is. And it is our job not to let them do that.
It's our job to call them out. It's our job to call them out.
Yes.
Joe, Magda, thank you both very much for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.